pals, I'm here today to do quite an exciting video, for me at least. So I have for quite a few years now done anticipated releases videos, and I usually do one for each quarter of the year. So I did one for January, February, March. I had 14 books featured in that video, and this year, if you followed me for a while, you know that I managed to really reduce my physical TBR, so that's all the unread books I owned. I got it down to less than 10, which felt amazing. And so I've been able to read books like as soon as they come in the house. I borrow books from the library. A lot of my reading now, probably, 70 to 80% is from the library, which I love. And yeah, I borrow them from the library and read them really quickly, or I buy them and read them really quickly. And so I've actually managed to work my way through this list of 14 books. I've just finished the last one a couple of days ago, and so yeah, I'm going to sort of rank them. So I did DNF a couple, and then I'm going to go through them in order of starting with DNFs, then lowest star rating all the way up to the books I enjoyed the most. Let's crack on, because there's a lot of books to talk about. The first one is Liar, Dreamer, Thief by Maria Dong. And in all honesty, this was one that I almost cut from the original video because I was a little bit unsure of the title. The reason for that is that one of my pet peeves in books, something I just cannot get on board with, is dream sequences. I think in real life, it's one of those things where your own dreams can feel really fascinating, but when other people tell you their dreams, it's not really that interesting. That in a book, when they run on about them for a couple of pages, I just find really tiresome, and I am not a fan of it. And so I always was concerned because of the title, but then I heard, I think Sabrina review this one and sort of said it was a bit of a mixed bag, and then I didn't really hear anyone else talk about it, and I checked out a few more reviews, and a lot of people said that the dream sequences were a part of the book, and so I just decided to wipe that one from the list. I didn't even attempt to read it. And that's the only one I made that decision with. The rest of them I attempted to read. So I DNF'd 3. I feel, similarly about all of them. The first one I DNF'd is Wayward by Amelia Hart. I think I read around 70 pages of that one. And when I put this on my anticipated releases video, I said based on premise, I was intrigued by this, but that the cover design didn't bode well. And my reason for that is the cover design, I think, looks quite sort of commercial historical fiction. It didn't make me think that the writing style would be to my taste, and that is entirely how I felt. I spoke about this in a recent video. Wayward is a historical fiction novel about 3 related women, one in the 1700s, one in the early 1900s, and one in the present day, and they are all linked by this cottage called Wayward, and there is elements of the Gothic and witchcraft. I thought the writing was really basic and just easy to read, but there was absolutely nothing special about it. I thought it ticked a lot of key points that we're used to seeing in Gothic historical fiction. I just didn't feel like it was offering me anything new at all, and it wasn't doing anything in a particularly special way, so I decided to bin that one off. The next one is Bad Cree by Jessica Johns. Again, probably shouldn't have put this one on the list. There was a lot about it that I thought sounded really intriguing, but again, this one had the dream element. So this is about a young woman who was living, I think, God, my memory's not going to do me well here, I think maybe in Toronto, and her sister has been missing for many years, and she sort of went missing off the reservation where they're from. And she starts to be followed by crows, and then she starts to have these crows in her dream, and also her sister's in the dream, but stuff happens in the dream that when she comes back to the present and wakes up, she'll be carrying something that was from the dream, right? And so she decides to go back home and try and figure out what's going on. A lot of the book is dream sequences. I think premise-wise, theme-wise, I found this book really interesting. I like that idea of somebody going missing, or there being some crime element that hasn't really been uncovered, and then in the present day somebody looking into that. I find that interesting, but I just don't think the writing style was that great. There was a couple of lines that were I let go of the breath I didn't know I was holding, and there was quite a few instances of that type of sentence, that type of really tropey sentence we see in so many books, and that happened fairly regularly, so I just started to lose my faith in the writer. So I DNF'd this one, I think a sort of similar amount in. I maybe got a little bit further, maybe 100 pages. The next one I DNF'd very early, probably on page 20, and that's The Shadow Casket by Chris Wooding. This is the second book following The Ember Blade by Chris Wooding, which is a high epic fantasy book, which I really enjoyed and found a really fun read. It read like it could be a standalone, so I feel like I'm happy just leaving it at that. There was elements in the first book that towards the end I was finding a little bit tiresome. There was a hint of a romance which I didn't love, and that seemed to be like it was going to be a much stronger thing in this book. I also felt like maybe the book had been like right book, right time, the first one I mean, because I think I just picked it up and I was really in the mood for that sort of thing. Whereas when I was reading the start of the second one, I just felt the writing wasn't that strong. And like I said, I found the romantic trope stuff already annoying. And so I went and had a look at reviews, and a lot of people were just saying, yeah, like the romance stuff in this one's really poor and takes over a lot of the narrative. Maybe this will be one when there's not loads of other books I'm excited about, I'll come back to, but I didn't really feel any qualms with DNFing it. So now we're on to the ones I have actually finished. The first one, and one I didn't really enjoy, although I think it has a lot of interesting points, is Brutes by Diz Tate. This was one I said that I was really interested in because it is a coming of age story about a group of girls, and it is told in the plural, which is something that I always think is a bit different and interesting to read. And it was about a young girl who went missing in an area in Florida where children lived in this apartment block, and everyone was very working class. And so yeah, I thought this sounded intriguing. This book leans on sort of absurdist, magical, realist stuff, which isn't something I enjoy anymore. Used to love it, really don't enjoy it now. I feel like it sort of disconnects me from the characters. There was elements of this writing about girlhood, to do with like the smells of a young girl's skin, like that mixture of like sweets and impulse body spray and nail polish, like moments like that where I think she really captured what it is to be a young girl, especially in a group of young girls, that I really enjoyed. But I felt there was too many things that I felt held at a distance from. I think this book could have not had the weird stuff and still worked. And there's also some elements where she writes from the perspective of the girls once they're adults. There's 4 or 5 of those, and they all read as the same person, like their narrative voice was the same, which I think is just a failing on the author's part. So yeah, this was one that I found interesting, but in all honesty, if it hadn't been such a short book, I would have DNF'd it, but it was just like a couple of 100 pages. So I was like, I might as well like finish it and see where it goes. But I think if this book finds the right reader, it will be enjoyed. I'm just not the right reader. The next one, I'm putting this quite low on the list, which I think a lot of people will find surprising because lots of people love this book, and that is Wandering Souls by Cecile Pin, which was long listed for the Women's Prize. I enjoyed this book. I think it was too short for what it was attempting to do. I think it was attempting to fit in quite a large history, quite a big shift in this character's life, and to do that in such a short amount of text, I didn't think was the greatest choice. I also think that a lot of this book's emotional heft relied on actual historical facts, and the author hadn't had to think that up. A lot of the elements in the book that were like fake newspaper articles were actually very close to the original writing of some newspaper articles that I sort of went and had a look into. And so I felt like a lot of the emotional response people have had to this book is more down to the content, which is factual, than the way the author actually dealt with it. And I think that like the writing style was nice, but it wasn't much beyond that. And I also don't think that I really felt attached to these characters. I felt like they were people, they were vessels for this story to be told, rather than characters I actually felt connected to. I liked it enough to keep an eye out on what this author brings out in the future, but yeah, I didn't like it anywhere near as much as most people seem to be enjoying it. The next one is Last Summer on State Street by Toya Wolff, which is the one I just finished. This is again about a group of young girls. This is set in the 1990s in Chicago. It is set on State Street, and you're seeing it from the perspective of a young girl called Fifi, who is 11. She has 3 girls in her friendship group, and they're from very different backgrounds. One of them is the daughter of the sort of drug queen pin of the housing estate. One of them is the daughter of the pastor, and then one of them is the daughter of a crack addict. And so you're sort of seeing their friendship and seeing what happens when the daughter of the crack addict sort of goes missing. Initially, I really enjoyed this book. I think there's elements of her writing style that are really nice, and I will definitely pick up what she writes in the future. But I felt that, especially towards the end of this book, again, this is quite a short book, it's only a couple of 100 pages, the author wraps this all up in too neat a bow. I thought the author didn't want to give the reader any room for their own interpretation of what may have happened, and so she literally put like a full stop at the end of every plot point or sort of thematic thing that she'd started. And towards the last 50 pages that happened more and more, and I think it really lessened the impact of the book for me, because yeah, it just felt like a less confident writer towards the end. So glad I read this. I think she writes really beautifully about families and what it's like to be a child, living through such a time of sort of change and turmoil. And like I said, I'll pick up whatever she writes next. A book on a sort of similar theme, and there was elements of Toya Wolf's writing that did remind me of Tayari Jones' writing. This next book is Leaving Atlanta by Tayari Jones. This was actually released quite a few years ago in the US. It was one of Tayari Jones', I think maybe even her first book, but it's only just been picked up in the UK and published, so to me it was like a new release. And this is the last of Tayari Jones' books I had to read because I'm a really big fan of her work. And I really enjoyed this one. It isn't, my favourite of her books, but I still think it's worth reading if you enjoy her work. This is set in Atlanta, in a period, I think in the 80s, when a serial killer was killing young children, predominantly young black boys, from the same neighbourhood, and we are following several children who live in that neighbourhood, who go to the same school as a lot of the children that have gone missing. Tayari Jones writes really beautifully about the senses. So when she introduces a character, she'll tell you what they smell like and what their skin feels like and what it feels like for the child to rest their head on their mother's stomach or something like that. So you get a real immediate sense of a room or a person or the surroundings, because she really grounds you. And I think that works really beautifully in Leaving Atlanta in particular, because we're hearing from a child's perspective, and being told what an 11-year-old child thinks of as like their mother's scent and how that makes them feel safe is like this beautiful nostalgic thing. And I think what she really does brilliantly in this book as well is captures especially young girls on the cusp of moving to be a teenager, and some of these young girls want to run into being a teenager with open arms, want to start having boyfriends and staying out late, and some of them really don't, and they don't like the fact that their body's developing, and they don't like the fact that boys are starting to notice them, and to sort of hear that push and pull, and how as a young black girl simply living in a body that is developing earlier than you want it to is a dangerous place to be. I think she writes all that really, really well. So yeah, I'd recommend this. This hasn't got a massive plot to it. It is pretty much a retelling of that time period, but from several children's point of view. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. And the next book is Other Woman by Emma Flint. This is a historical fiction novel set 6 years after World War I in London. And this is a book I raced through. I think I read it in just over a day. And this is one of the books, there's quite a few of these coming up, that I look back on really fondly for having read it so quickly and just not wanting to sort of do anything that pulled me away from it. So this is based on a real life murder trial that took place just after the First World War. And we see this from two different women's perspectives. We have one woman who is married to this man, and we have another woman who is a secretary and comes across this man at her job and starts to have an affair with him. So the book opens with the affair and sort of builds up to a certain point in their relationship, and then the book flips perspective to the wife, and the wife's perspective starts when the trial has already started. So you don't hear what actually happened for this murder trial to be taking place right until the end. The author sort of writes around it and comes back around to it. This book is a fascinating look at the views on women at the time. It's pretty horrific how the people in the courtroom and the press view this trial. Even many women who come into the courtroom are just overcome by how attractive the man on trial is, and they want him to sort of be this romantic hero, and they're willing to believe anything about him. It's also a really interesting look at like the investigations on murder cases at the time. Like, it must have been so easy to get away with murder because like just their ability to investigate is pretty shoddy. So I found all that really interesting. Emma Flint is nowhere near as good a writer as Sarah Waters, but her writing style does certainly remind me of Sarah Waters. This has a similar theme to The Paying Guest in a sort of similar time period, and she also writes really beautifully about like the clothes they wore at the time, the way they set their hair, what a room may look like, the food they may be eating. I found that the historical detail in this was really strong, and I just really enjoyed reading it. So yeah, I would recommend this one. Then another one that came out a few years ago in the US but only just came out here is Before You Suffocate Your Own Full Self by Danielle Evans. This is a short story collection, and this has recently been published in the UK because of the success of her most recently published short story collection, The Office of Historical Corrections. So You Only Suffocate Your Own Full Self came out before The Office of Historical Corrections, was written before that, but has been published after it in the UK. Does that make sense? I really enjoyed this. I think she writes really beautifully in this. Again, there are quite a few stories that are focused around young girls that I just found really powerful stories. Again, she writes really well about that age where you're on the cusp of childhood and adolescence. And when I read both of her collections, very simply, I just feel like I can really trust her as a writer. I never know how to describe authors like this, because I just think they just write really well, and there's not like a dud sentence, there's not anything that needed to be like edited away or added. Everything is to perfection, and even if not all the stories in this collection were brilliant, none of them were weak. They were all, you know, solid stories or great stories, and I'll continue to pick up whatever books she releases. And the next book is A Spell of Good Things by Ayobami Adebayo. This is an interesting one because I think after her first novel, which was a great literary and commercial success, people expected the same from this one. And this one hasn't really been promoted that much by the publisher. I haven't heard many people talk about it, and it makes sense once you've read it because it is very different. On the one hand, it feels like it's the same writer because it has similar themes, but on the other hand, it feels like a completely different writer because this is an intensely slow book with lots of secondary characters. The world is really filled out, but it does feel like the author goes on a lot of tangents and sort of side quests in order to give you a real feel of this world, which is contemporary Nigeria. And that means it takes you a long time to get to the point. So I'm putting this one here because even though a book like Other Women I read in just over a day and really enjoyed speeding through, and this one I think took me a few weeks to listen to an audio, and it wasn't really until right at the end that I felt compelled to be like, right, I have to find something to do just to listen to this audiobook and get to the end. I think this book is more of an achievement than all the books I've previously mentioned. I think this is the sort of book, like I won't be surprised this is on the booker list. This book is saying a lot. So the premise of this is that we're following a young boy in contemporary Nigeria who is from a family that were sort of like middle class. His father was an academic, but he's recently lost his job, and they are struggling for money, and because of this, his life is really changing, and he gets put on this path, quite a dangerous path, in order to try and find money for his family and to change his life. And then we're also following a woman in her, I think her late 20s who is training to be a doctor and who is engaged to marry this man who has issues that are sort of dealt with. And the thing that draws these two very disparate stories together is a political campaign that is happening. These two different parts of society are all pulled together around this political campaign with devastating results. This book is bleak. It is not trying to pull any punches. It is incredibly sad, and yeah, you're not left with, you know, a silver lining, basically. The thing that really separates this book from her first novel is that this book, in a way, has like very little plot, but when you get to the end, you see that all the little plot points added up to this really big, awful thing. And in a way, I think that's really effective because it's sort of saying that there can be this slow trickle effect where both of the characters make what feel like initially small decisions to allow these things to happen that are clearly bad things, but they do it so gradually that it feels okay and feels allowable. And then at the end, you see the results of this sort of slow drip, drip, drip of consequence. This book is a searing indictment on many things about contemporary Nigeria, but primarily I would say she comments on wealth and privilege and the class divides, and also gender imbalance. There's a really big conversation going on with Wariola's story about what it means to be a woman and the expectations of her to get married. And in Eniola's story, the young boy, there is a really big discussion about the shame his father feels at no longer being able to provide for his family as the man of the house. So there's lots of really interesting discussions going on here. This is a book I would certainly reread. I think it would be a really good book club pick, but I also understand why some people might read this and just be like, get to the point. So there's that one. Then we have The Deluge by Stephen Markley. Now, I had no idea where to put this on the list because when I read this, I said I was going to review it, and I still haven't, and I probably won't, because it is a beast and I'm not quite sure how I'm supposed to review it. This book is around 900 pages long and it has small font and it's a massive hardback. There is a lot of text to the page. I've lost count of how many narrators, maybe around 10. There is also mixed media in the book, and the book opens in I think 2016 and ends in maybe 2030 or something like that. And in large part, the book is looking at all these different characters across the political spectrum, including people involved in investment banking, climate change scientists, people who work for the government, all these different people. And in large part, it's talking about global warming and it's focusing in on the US and what that may do even in the next 10 years and how the government and the world stage really has all these choices they can make, but they will continue to not make them because everyone just wants to be rich, or everybody, meaning the top 5%, want to continue to be rich while everybody else drowns in the floodwaters and dies in the droughts. So it's a really bleak book. It's saying a lot and it is a struggle to get through because there are sections that are just written like political manifestos. There are sections that are just written like environmental papers written by a scientist who specialises in the field. There's newspaper articles. You've got to have a lot of patience. It does pull together in a pretty epic way, and there is something that happens in the plot at the end that is really interesting and will make you want to go and reread this book. But I did find with this book, it took me weeks to read because it doesn't really pull you plot-wise back to pick it up. There was a certain storyline where towards the end I felt like I really needed to know what happened. Interestingly, that's the storyline that most closely resembles his first novel, Ohio, but the rest of it is pretty slow moving. A lot of the sections are just quite arduous to get through, especially the political and scientific stuff. I've watched some interviews about this book and it is an accomplishment in terms of the sheer amount of research that went into this book. It took him 10 years to write. He had to keep updating it because real things happened in our world that were worse than what he'd predicted, so then he had to rewrite it. Super depressing. But I think in part the ambition of the narrative is maybe not held up by the character work. And I think that's because there are so many characters and those characters all need to represent something about society that I didn't feel super attached to many of them. And I'm not sure I feel that I completely buy some of them as characters. When I remember this book, I remember the experience and the storyline rather than thinking, oh God, that person, So yeah, on the one hand, this book could be looked at as this massive achievement, and on the other hand, you could say this book is a slight failure. And I'm still not quite sure where I sit on that, but I feel like I have to put it this high just because of the sheer ambition and scope. And it will be one of the most memorable books I've read this year because it is mad. On to the top two books that I enjoyed the most, and the first one being I Have Some Questions For You by Rebecca Mackay. I loved reading this book. I sped through it. I read it in 2 days and it was just a delight to get through. We read this for my Patreon book club and I had a fun time chatting to the others about it. So this is about a woman who runs a podcast and she is invited back to her boarding school in New England that she went to in the 90s, where one of her classmates was killed. The athletics coach, who happened to be the only person of colour on campus, was arrested for it and is still in prison. And she started to have doubts about it and also concerns about her own implication in him being found guilty. And so she's invited back to the school to give some lessons on podcasts, and she sort of covertly encourages one of the students to investigate the crime. And the book is a fascinating discussion about true crime and the nature of our obsession with true crime and who has the right to tell these type of stories. Is it only the victim? Is it the wrongfully accused? Is it the family members of the victim? Is it the people who were closest at the time, like the people who were in this school at the time of the murder? All these people are players, but you're not quite sure who should be allowed to tell this story. And our protagonist constantly feels like she doesn't have the right, but also she really wants to. And there's also other discussions going on within the narrative just about sort of social media. Her husband is called out for an inappropriate relationship many years before, and it's questioned as to whether his wife should have to sort of suffer for this. Should she be cancelled alongside him? And yeah, just really interesting discussions being had about this rise in internet culture and how it allows for all these discussions to take place live online, and maybe how that isn't always super helpful. Aside from all that, it is just a compelling book. It is, sometimes I read these books that I think if I'd read a version of this as a teenager, like a teenage version of this, I would also have loved it, but I love it even more now that it's like an adult version of those books. I don't think this book is absolutely perfect. There were a couple of sentences where I thought like a little bit like too much when she was describing like the landscape or something, but I did get a real sense for this college, and I was really pulled into the story. The book is written to a certain person, and you find out who that person is quite early, but I won't spoil it, and that is just a really great device. It feels very accusatory throughout the text, which is really interesting. I just had a blast reading it. I really enjoyed it. And then lastly, my favourite book, and I think this is probably my favourite read of the year so far, is Burnham Wood by Eleanor Catton. I again said I would review this and still haven't. I still hope to. I just worry that I can't do this book justice. I think this book is an amazing achievement. It is a blend of, brilliant, intelligent writing and an absolutely banging plot. It is mad. It feels like you got a pretty serious, smart writer to just include some Quentin Tarantino in her book. It is like, as a film, this would be epic. I just loved it. I thought it was such fun to read, and I've heard so many people say this was really slow to get into and they really struggled. By page 3, was hooked, and I read this one really quickly as well, and I would happily reread it. I thought it was so fun. Very briefly, because this is a really popular book, this is about an area in New Zealand where there is a landslide. That landslide closes off a large portion of land, and there is a guerrilla gardening group that have been using areas of private land that are sort of being ignored to grow produce to provide to people. And they hear about this area of land, they sneak into it, and when the sort of leader of this group is there, she meets this billionaire who has flown into this land on his helicopter, and they sort of make a bargain to work together. And it is about the consequences of that bargain, of this really left-wing socialist group taking a payout from this billionaire who represents everything they abhor, and the shit that goes down from there. And I loved it. I thought it was a wild ride, and it is one I would have loved to read as part of a book club because, it's just, I loved it. So those are the 14 books that I was excited to read in the first few months of the year, and like I said, I managed to read most of them. I think my success rate was pretty good. Yes, there were a few I DNF'd and a couple that I didn't love, but even the ones down the lower end of the list, I still like found interesting things within them. And like most of these writers, I would seek out other books they've written. I'm definitely going to go back and read Eleanor Catton and Rebecca Mackay's backlist because I haven't read any of her books. I haven't read The Luminaries, I know, bad. So yeah, but I would love to hear your thoughts if you've read any of these books, what your thoughts were on them, and also if you had any anticipated releases and what you thought of them, and if you have any recommendations based on the books I enjoyed, always happy to hear that. Thanks for watching, thanks for your support, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!